This podcast was sponsored by and recorded at Crossing's Pub and Eatery on Hyde Park.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be tuning in on the digital universe. We welcome you to another episode of the Vicars Crossing here from London at Crossing's Pub and Eatery. My name is Rob Henderson. I'm the rector and priest at Holy Trinity St. Stephen's Memorial Anglican Church in London on the corner of Southdale and Wellington, and I'm here again with Kevin.
Yes, sirree. I'm Kevin George, rector of St. Aidan's Church, which is at Oxford Street West. And glad to be back on the air.
All right.
Is there any air involved in this?
There is air.
Okay.
We are currently breathing it.
Okay, good.
And that is the science portion of the program
Yes,
today.
You're welcome.
Good. Well, it's good that you're back with us, everybody, and we thank you again for finding us. Whether you're listening on iTunes or YouTube or SoundCloud, we appreciate the time. And today we have a special guest that Kevin's going to introduce here in just a moment, and we're going to get into some discussion about the shooting in Pittsburgh at the Tree of Life Synagogue, which has been on the minds of many of us over the last few days. So we're going to get into that in just a minute. But before we do, I thought it was somewhat appropriate that we're gathering today to record our podcast on November the 1st. And as I was chatting with Kevin before, we're recognizing this day in our church calendar as All Saints, or the Feast of All Saints. And I've always kind of thought that All Saints was a day that doesn't get a lot of hype over, Christmas and Easter and the big ones like that. But All Saints to me has always been a really important day on our calendar because it's a day that's traditionally and on Sundays, a lot of people will be doing this in church. They'll be remembering loved ones, and they'll be lighting candles, and they'll be taking a moment to give thanks to God for those in their lives that were important in their life and certainly in their faith. But more importantly, it's a day that we gather together as community and we tend to our grief, which is something that I think often we don't do too well communally. We rarely sit down and have coffee with someone and say, so how's your grief doing? Mm-hmm. But it is something that all of us share. It is part of our humanity. And it's important that we get together and we do that communally and next to each other. And I've always found it moving on those All Saints services when I'm up lighting a candle to remember people in my life that I miss or love, that there's always someone standing next to me sharing that same experience. And it's quite moving and powerful. So I want to recognize that today on this November the 1st, All Saints. And I think that's a good way to kind of frame what we're going to be talking about today, especially with something going on tonight. And I'm going to let you kind of take it from there and introduce our guest.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think that that's actually a good point, Rob, because on this feast day for us in the Christian church, what we're doing is tending and remembering the souls of the righteous. And at this juncture in our lives this week, when we've all been so shocked and really torn apart by the acts of violence in Pittsburgh at Tree of Life, we thought it would be appropriate this week to be able to bring on Rabbi Debra Dressler from Temple Israel to speak with us. And we're glad you could come here and be with us. Welcome.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I thought we might just begin by acknowledging that for many of us, we just sort of had to get our heads wrapped around what was happening. I sort of look at the events at the Tree of Life Synagogue as one of those things where you sort of say, you'll look back and say, you know what you were doing when you heard that. And so for me, I was thinking about, we actually had a community gathering last Saturday at the church. It was a sort of a pilgrimage workshop weekend. We had a speaker in. He was talking about the works of a couple of Celtic writers and about the sacredness of all life and everything that goes along with that. And when in the midst of that, with the modern technology we have, when I saw on my phone that this horrific shooting had taken place, and we took time and we stopped what we were doing and we prayed because we had people together, and it felt like it was an appropriate thing to do before we knew even how very serious it all was. And I know, like Rob, you happened to be at that event too, but I
I
know it
was,
just sort
yeah.
of shook me to the core, and I don't know if you wanted to share
Oh,
how you
very
felt,
much
but-
so. I mean, in the midst of us going about what we were doing, to have this news flash in front of us, and we know with social media today how quickly word spreads, and it just it certainly it cut me. I mean, I heard it, and my heart just sank. I could not believe that was going on. But like Kevin said, to have that moment to just stop and offer prayer as a community, and to offer prayers and to do that communally together was very powerful, and a reminder that even in the midst of all that difficulty that we were feeling in that moment, that we could look to each other and know that we weren't alone in it, which I think is a real important thing that we always have to remember.
Very
when these
important,
things
and
happen.
for us to name out loud that the folks who are in the Jewish community in our own city were not alone, and that we were remembering you in prayer at that time. And as I come to that, I guess, Deborah, I'd ask you to, you would have perhaps been in prayers.
Yes, I was.
So how did you come to learn this, and what was your initial reaction? I mean, it must have been difficult.
So, as I was thinking about this question, what was I doing? Of course, it was a Saturday morning, and we were in services much as were being held in Pittsburgh at the Tree of Life Synagogue. And one of the blessings and curses of technology is that it brings a lot of messages to me. Yeah. But if I'm not careful about curating what I'm watching, a lot will get lost. Right. And because I'm an American citizen and we have a big election coming up, I've been following more American news. And I remember being in services and glancing when my wrist vibrated, and I saw something about shooting, but I never saw the headline because there were so many other alerts coming behind it. And that to me is sort of almost a metaphor for how we deal with this kind of news. And we were very intent in our services. We had a special guest. We had a special learning session afterwards. And it really wasn't until that was over that we all kind of came up for air. None of my members of my congregation had the headline either. Oh. But I started to hear from my non-Jewish colleagues. Yeah. And suddenly I realized that I was getting multiple messages and that something had happened.
Yeah. Wow.
So it's really clear that we're not alone, because even when we were in our bubble of Shabbat worship, other people were thinking of us and reaching out to us.
Right. Interesting what the technology does, right? So I mean, even if you couldn't be sure what was going on, something was going on.
Right. And it was interesting too, because it was around that moment that we were having discussions in the group at St. Aidan's Church. We were talking about the spirituality of when one part of us as human beings is affected by something, it affects all the other parts.
Yeah.
And that was a spiritual message that we were talking about in this. Yeah. And so for that to come, that news to come in our bubble, as you say, and then to stop and pray and know that that all were being affected was quite a moment.
And I just remember being viscerally inside of me aware as I prayed in that moment, and we stopped and we took silence. We're not normally in our churches on Saturday mornings praying, like you folks are in temple or in synagogue. So I just found an incredible experience in my body to know that as I prayed and thought of you folks and others that we knew, that, and it crossed my mind. I thought, my friend Rabbi Debra Dressler probably doesn't even know this, right? Because and so it's really, it was a powerful experience through the work of prayer to try and be connected and to know what we might be able to do, just even to come alongside. So.
I think what was really powerful for some of us is, as the news started to come in the wake of our own services, was that instant recognition that this is what the victims were doing. This was a synagogue. They were in their morning service. They were celebrating a life cycle, and that's what we were doing. And it could have happened to anybody.
Right.
And so we had that immediate sense of affinity and despair.
Yes, right. Well, like most people, we've been watching this over the last few days and thinking about the folks in Pittsburgh and all those affected and the families and such. Rabbi Jeffrey Myers from the Tree of Life Synagogue has been on TV doing interviews and such, and people have been wanting to know what's happening with the community and the funerals that have been happening and such. And I wanted to ask you, Deborah, he did an interview, I think it was CNN, and one of the questions to him was, Rabbi, what do you want the leaders of your country to know? What was your message? And the words he said really struck me. He said, my message is, words of hate must cease. Words of hate must cease. Just those few words were really, really powerful. I guess the question for us is, when we come together and have this conversation as people of faith, how do people of faith instill that message into our day-to-day lives, other than just what we can do individually, but as part of faith communities and a part of the connections that we have in our communities? What do you think? How do we live this every day?
Well, I think it's brought home how powerful words are. And certainly in Jewish tradition, we experience God and connect to God through text a lot of the time. Even our prayer is scripted. It's a structured worship. Although there's room for personal reflection and prayer, we do things in a way that's based on the text that we have chosen. And one of my early responses as I was thinking about it, and again, my congregation in the building had left, but my congregation through our social media accounts was still out there and needed to hear from me. And I felt the need to choose my words very carefully. There was a need that had to be met, but there was also the risk of giving people the wrong idea or the wrong message. But I did it, as I thought about it, I did settle on this idea that, rhetoric can kill. Maybe not in the moment, but careless words and reckless ideas eventually can create this false sense that it's okay, and that it normalizes something that should never be conceived as normal and appropriate. And that's what really, where I was left, is we really have to be careful with what we say, but at the same time recognizing the power of words to heal, to inspire, to comfort. So again, it's a double-edged sword. Words have a lot of power, and we have to wield it wisely.
Yeah, and being aware of that and conscious of that is so important.
Well,
So important.
I mean, I just think that what's happening is the words, there's a lot of radicalization happening in the world. And I think that what's really shocking for us is coming to realization in the West that, because we always see this as something that happens, overseas, people are being radicalized at home perhaps by radical Islam and so on. But what's happening now, and what we're seeing, is the real threat are, sort of very right-wing white folks who get radicalized. And now the words of hate are coming from the highest offices in the land. And that's what's so alarming for me. I find that very scary. I don't mind saying. I was chatting with my brother from out east, and he sent me this piece about Philip Reitman, and I don't know if you know about Philip Reitman or not, but he was a Polish survivor of Auschwitz, and 14 years old when he left. His parents perished, and he came to live in Newfoundland, which was quite a switch. But he grew up in Newfoundland, and he didn't speak about his ordeal for 49 years. He refused to talk about it. And then he came to a realization in, I think it was 1989, that he really needed to speak, that these stories were important and they needed to be told. And he began touring the schools in Eastern Canada and then eventually across the United States and everywhere. He died just a few years ago at 97. He had eventually moved to Bedford, Nova Scotia. But one of the things that one of the students wrote in a school newspaper in this article my brother had sent to me later last night was, he said to the parents and teachers assembled in this school, I am begging you to teach your children love. Never, never teach them to hate. The only way to conquer the world is with love. Hate will destroy the world. And it was just sort of, he found his voice. And it was a reminder to us, I mean, look, we all need to hear it. In 2015, it was a Christian church in South Carolina. In 2017, it was a mosque in St. Foy, Quebec. And now it's a synagogue in Pittsburgh. None of us are unscathed by the violence of it all. And somehow or another, I think I agree with you, Deborah, that the words are powerful, but they can be a powerful agent of change for the good. And so I'm reminded of Desmond Tutu's words that goodness is stronger than evil, love is stronger than hate, light is stronger than darkness, life is stronger than death, victory is ours through God who loves us. And I think that those of us who are engaged in works in community, and those of us who have leadership positions in our community, I think we need to find those words, because there's a lot of hateful words out there right now. But finding a way to continue to fill our Facebook feeds and our Twitter feeds and our sermons and our blogs and all the things that we write to people, our emails to one another, and the way we exchange words with each other, finding those words of love are so critically important, because we may not be able to change everything all at once, but we can certainly change how we treat one another by reaching for words that are about respect and love and all that stuff from the get-go, instead of sort of taking the cynical. There's just so much cynicism, and I just want to see us turn from it.
Yeah. And as a person of faith too, I have to do some inner reflection on this kind of stuff as well, and admit that there are times that I have heard that type of hate speech or demoralizing speech coming from people, and I didn't speak out.
Right.
And I was quiet about it, or I froze, or I walked away, or I said, "Oh, it's just
Don't want
it's
the
just
conflict.
so and so
It's
being
easier to
so and
just-
so. Yeah, that's just the way it is." But as people of faith, I think we do have a responsibility to speak out about that, and not in a hateful way, but in a loving way. And that's the other thing that Rabbi Myers had said. Somebody asked him about, about the people that were saying that they did not want President Trump to come to Pittsburgh. But his response was, "But that's just hate speech back, in the
Right.
sense of negative, that sort of thing." So it's important for us to know what our place is, and to, in a loving way, call that out when we hear it, and start to make a difference that way.
Yeah, impressive to me too with him was his, around that, was his willingness to, regardless of what the president decided to do, if he decided to heed advice or not, was to extend that hand of hospitality,
Right.
Regardless of, I'm sure, a lot of hurt. And so he's an impressive individual.
Yeah, I can't imagine. I mean, he's one of the victims. He was there,
Yeah.
and he was literally pulling his congregants to safety.
Yes.
And yet he's there 24/7 serving as their rabbi, without even the opportunity to process what he went through himself.
And his own grief.
Exactly.
own grief, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He's been remarkable. And it's certainly given me a lot of inspiration.
I bet.
And at the same time, this just heartbreaking compassion that anybody has to be good at this.
Right. Yeah, it's a sad statement in itself. Leadership in our own church has taken time to speak. In the Anglican Church of Canada, the House of Bishops happened to have been meeting as well. That was another group of leaders all gathered together praying when this happened on Saturday. And so before they broke, they released a statement to show solidarity and support with the Jewish community. And I thought I'd read this for our listeners, or those who may not have heard this brief statement. But on Sunday, the Most Reverend Colin Johnson wrote the following statement on behalf of the members of the National House of Bishops in the name of the Primate Fred Hiltz. And he writes, Jonathan Sacks, former chief rabbi of Great Britain, who addressed the worldwide Anglican bishops at the Lambeth Conference in 2008, wrote this: "If you cannot recognize the image of God in a person who does not look or think like you, then you have made God in your own image and have begun to worship an idol." Yesterday's killings of Jews in Pittsburgh while they were at Sabbath prayers was a horrifying event that affects us all. No life, whether in Pittsburgh or on the streets of Toronto or in the bush, on a reserve, or in the cities of Syria or South Sudan, no life is expendable. Anti-Semitism has a long and terrible history in our Christian tradition. It is still alive in too many places and in too many hearts. It should have no place in the hearts and minds of Christians today. I call on you, writes the House of Bishops, we call on you to pray for those who have died, for those who grieve the loss of loved ones, for those who are caught in the web of anger and hatred. I call on us to challenge the words of prejudice and hatred spoken in public or behind closed doors. I call on us to extend hands of friendship and compassion, not only to friend but stranger. I call us to act for reconciliation in places of brokenness and pain. Rabbi Sacks also wrote this: All the high ideals in the world, the human as God's image, belief in God's unity, and the love of neighbors, count for little until they are turned into habits of action that become habits of the heart. Jesus said, "Love your neighbor as yourself." That statement from our House of Bishops, which was meeting just this past weekend. Your response to that, Rabbi?
Well, it's so wonderful to have that immediate response from so many different communities. As the reality of the situation was sinking in, it could have been very easy to feel isolated and vulnerable, and we certainly feel vulnerable in those moments, but the immediate response from an institutional level to a personal level, there really was not a moment that we were alone with this news. And so that statement really speaks to that idea that immediately people understood what was wrong and how this is against all of our faith traditions. This isn't one faith tradition over another.
No.
And that there was the willingness to act so quickly, to denounce it and to offer that hand of friendship and support.
Yeah. Rob, I think you've got something else over there too. He's been reading and studying that guy.
Yeah.
He's incredible, that guy.
The podcast we've been doing, Rabbi, is something that was important to us because we're always trying to find ways to understand how our faith life intersects with the public life, and that we don't compartmentalize our faith and just keep it on in the church or wherever we may be, but how those two things touch each other. And so whenever we talk about how faith intersects with culture, we try as best we can, of course, to understand the context of the culture that we're living in. And we know that this shooting took place in a specific context in the United States of 2018 and all that encompasses. And I was interested to get your thoughts on these words that I heard from journalist Fareed Zakaria this week. And he wrote this: "One of the most extraordinary features of modern American life is the integration of its Jewish community. For over 2,500 years, Jews have been vilified and persecuted everywhere. And then came America and Israel, two places where Jews could breathe easy and live safely. In this country, Jews have been deeply patriotic and productive citizens, scaling the heights of achievement, but also becoming leaders, philanthropists, and good citizens. Yet we have seen an unmistakable rise in anti-Semitism." So, as an American citizen, do you sense that your country is becoming more anti-Semitic? And perhaps on the other side of things now, as a resident in Canada, have you or your congregants at the temple here experienced that same rise in any way?
Well, it's been interesting because as unfortunately, these tragedies of the last few years have pointed out, there is no one group that's targeted. Right. At the same time, I've been somewhat shocked to learn through some of the Jewish organizations that anti-Semitism is growing more than other hate crimes, that the Jews are being targeted in a disproportionate way. And that was a real loss of innocence for me, as years go by and you grow up, in my case, in a post-Holocaust world, right, with Holocaust education and civic education about diversity. I wouldn't have thought that these were lessons that needed to be learned. Mm. So one is the heartbreaking reality that there just isn't enough that has changed the hearts and minds of some people. And of course, it's not personal. Most of the people who are perpetrating these acts don't know Jews and don't have people in their life. You know, this it's an idea of something, and I just think it's tragic, and I'm unprepared sometimes for that reality because that wasn't what I grew up thinking. Certainly about the United States and in Canada, where I find that very uncommon, and yet I know through these agencies that there is a lot of anti-Semitism that still exists.
Yeah, I guess, I was just watching on some of the news over the last couple of days that I guess it's the Antidefamation League in the United States talking about a 57% rise in just the last 2 years, which is astonishing. It's just more than you can get your head wrapped around, really. And, as you say, we're all children far past. We grew up our history in terms of the stuff we learned in books.
Yeah.
But, you know, we learn about our ancestors who fought, you know, went overseas to beat back these sort of Nazi attitudes and these anti-Semitic attitudes. And it's somehow shocking, I think, for people in our generation to see this stuff rise up. Like, it is just sort of alarming. I can't, and then, but then, as you say, I mean, it's never seems to go away. I mean, we can pick up the paper next week and somebody has spray painted the side of another synagogue, or, you know, left a, and as you say, it's not just anti-Semitism. I mean, you know, it's leaving body parts in front of mosque, and, you know, on and on it goes. I mean, there just doesn't seem to be an end to the amount of anger that there is out there, and this is why I think, you know, going back to what we said earlier, this need to sort of bring out the better angels of our nature. Mm-hmm. We need to recapture a way to be able to speak with more integrity, and I think that the current rhetoric in the United States politic, though, makes that very difficult.
Well, it definitely does. But at the same time, if there weren't people who wanted to hear those messages, it wouldn't have the same power.
Right, it wouldn't land.
So
That's
we
a great
can't
point.
really, you know, as much as I may have one political view or another,
Yes.
or an opinion about one stance or another, the reality is it doesn't really do anything if it falls on deaf ears.
Right, right.
So there's a wider issue, and of every ideology.
Mm-hmm.
There's inappropriate speech and antagonism where there really should be understanding,
Right.
and finding common cause. So it's tricky because it's easy to point to the political process, and it is a huge part of the media reality right
Right.
now.
Right.
And it feels different than it has in other times in my life. But at the same time, there's no one person to blame.
No.
There's a lot of people who are choosing to listen and choosing to agree with things that they shouldn't, and it's on all of them.
That's
and
right.
all of us.
And choosing to be silent.
Exactly.
Well,
Yeah.
that to my point, yeah. And when we do hear it and it does percolate, what's our response, especially as people of faith, to that when we hear it? And do we leave it hidden, or do we bring it out in the light and have these conversations?
You know, there was something in my homiletics class in seminary. Our teacher, who was one of the deans, when we were reviewing each other's sermons, we would videotape some of them and use them as a teaching tool. And there was something that had gone on in one of them, and most of us rabbinical students weren't bothered by it. And at the end of the conversation, he says, you know, that's ridiculous. Your congregants would see that. It would be disruptive. You need to understand it through their eyes. And he said something along the lines of, we're incredibly tolerant of people who agree with us. So that there's this like halo effect. If
That's
I
right.
agree with you about something that I see is important, I can easily fall into a trap of agreeing or seeming to agree with things that I shouldn't.
Right.
Right.
And that was an incredibly important lesson. And in these kinds of settings, I'm reminded of that constantly. Where are the ways that I can slip into that,
Right.
you know, bias because I agree in one way, and then I tolerate far less appropriate ideas from the same sources.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And I think that that's also a problem now, given that we consume our own news, right? So,
Exactly. When we can
so-
curate our feed,
Right,
we
right.
can
Yeah,
choose
we
to
decide what we
Choose what we
read.
want to hear
Yeah.
and read and see. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes it all the more difficult. I'm just wondering if you can share with our listeners a little bit about, you said a little bit about it already, but that sort of response that you've had from the community here in London and beyond, but certainly that and what it's meant to you, to your congregation. Are there any stories about what's come to you? And perhaps a few words about the event that's planned tonight. I mean, this will go to air after tonight's event, but to give people a sense of what this community is doing this evening.
Well, a couple of things come to mind. The first is, unfortunately, we're getting good at this.
Yes.
We had tools and ideas to respond, both as the recipients in the Jewish community and as the people reaching out to us, because we were just doing this a year ago and a
Right.
year before that. So first is the heartbreaking reality that this isn't unusual anymore.
No.
But I think what's been most important to me, and in some ways ties back to the conversation we were having about our words, words without relationships
Yeah.
don't have the same impact.
Mm-hmm.
And because of the work I know my congregation has done in interfaith activities through our peace camp and supporting the Muslim community last year after the Quebec shooting, I had that relationship with people,
Right.
and in a mutual relationship. So I guess that means I was reaching out last year. I didn't think of it that way. I was
Right.
just showing up and doing what I thought was right. But because of those experiences, and same with the other members of my community, suddenly I had relationships with people who were turning around and reaching out and supporting us instantly, like instantly without
Wow,
question,
that's great.
across every part of the faith community, Muslim, Christian, everything. And without those relationships, their words of healing and comfort and inspiration wouldn't have gotten to us as well. So I think that that's what's really stayed with me, is that there's enough trust and experience with each other that we can be a mutual support.
Right.
And that wouldn't have been true in a different time, that we didn't have those experiences with each other.
Or on a different, what we also have the benefit of where we live, right? Here we can do
Absolutely.
that.
Absolutely.
And I was taken to an extension to that, I guess, and maybe your thoughts on what I've read in the news about both the Muslim and Christian response in the Pittsburgh and wider Pittsburgh areas to the Tree of Life synagogue community. They've been right on it.
Well, that's what I think really spoke to me. And as much as the ache of the reality of what happened and the hatred behind it, there hasn't been a single setting or city or service that hasn't been full of non-Jewish people immediately.
Yeah.
And that was true in Toronto. That was certainly true when you were watching the initial vigil in Pittsburgh. That there really was no hesitation, despite the huge diversity in our ideologies and beliefs and within our faith groups. Like it's sometimes the harder part is to navigate within our own denominations,
Right.
and that everybody just forgot that they knew how to fight
Yes.
and remembered that they knew how to comfort
Right.
and to feel as one. It no longer mattered whether you were Jewish or Muslim or Christian, because everybody was affected and everybody felt the loss. So it was everybody's tragedy to mourn and to be of support. Again, the Jewish community are the ones facing a very personal loss right now, and not to minimize that, but that it didn't feel like somebody else's
Right.
problem to the wider community has been so consistent and so powerful to me.
Yeah, it really does speak to, as you were saying, the relational aspect of who we are with each other, despite our theologies and ideologies. What we share as human beings is the fact that we are affected by these things together. And when we're in relationship with each other, what happens is we end up being able to hold up the things that connect us more so than worrying about the things that might divide us. And especially in a time like this, it's unfortunate that sometimes it takes these things to get us to do that. But it's certainly a big reminder that that's who we are.
Yeah, and I think that's when I think hearing you talk about that too, about, even with all of our different beliefs and our different ideologies, I think it pulls out the dignity of difference, as Rabbi Sachs refers to it, right? It's that notion that, our difference is something that is to be celebrated, that is ordained, that is not an Achilles heel to us, but it's actually something that we should be able to celebrate. And it offers, for me, what's powerful about it is it offers a very different vision than what happened on Saturday, right? Like, so it's the opposite image. I mean, you've got this image of this radicalized and crazed person who's got so much hate in his heart, that's prepared to take on that sort of violence. And the response to it is so overwhelmingly the opposite. It's this idea that, wait a minute, because these people are different, we love them. Because I'm different than them, I love them. It's that idea that, we all bring something to bear to the beautiful order that is created. And if we're able to celebrate all of that and the diversity that goes with it, we might be able to paint a picture which is very different. And so I think that that's, for me, I think that that's where, that's what we have to do to help in the grief, is we need to know that even in the difference, the dignity of our differences is that we can hold one another's hands and we can stand shoulder to shoulder, regardless of our difference. A little bit about tonight. I don't know if you want to share. By the time people hear this, we will have done it. But let's let folks know what is or was happening.
Well, again, this is sort of surreal experience of putting something together that we haven't done before, and yet we sometimes feel like we know what needs to be done because it's not unprecedented. I guess if I were to characterize the memorial that's planned, is it's very similar to some of our communal memorials that we have in the spring around Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day, Yom HaZikaron, Remembrance Day. For the Jewish soldiers and victims of terror. There are certain motifs that are common to those kinds of observances. So we've been able to embrace some of those examples and the texts that would be common in that setting, while really seeking to include so many different voices from outside of the Jewish community. We have elected leaders, we have Muslim and Christian spokespeople, and just so quickly having willing partners. And I mean, every single message I got from people was, what can we do? What can we do? What can we do? And so, it's so complicated in the wake of something like this, and yet we could call people and invite them, and we had opportunities to lean on their wisdom and support. And I'm really looking forward to the sharing of our cultures. That's what really inspires me, and while supporting this very specific way of memorializing in the Jewish tradition.
Right. Yeah, I think it's a shame that we have to come together for what we're coming together for. But I look forward to this evening because I think it offers a different picture to the community. Elie Wiesel wrote these words: "We must take sides," he wrote. "Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. Sometimes we must interfere. When human lives are endangered, when human dignity is in jeopardy, national borders and sensitivities become irrelevant. Whenever men and women are persecuted because of their race, religion, or political views, that place must, at that moment, become the center of the universe." Boy, I read that again yesterday in light of all of what's happening, what's happened in Pittsburgh, what's happening at the southern border of the United States, what's happening across the world, where there just seems to be an increase in populism and a real sort of rage against the world in a way. And I wonder where we go from here. And I think his words are so critically important because so many of us just don't want to talk about it. And so I wondered if each of us might reflect on knowing something like that. Where do we go from here? How do we respond to the call to take sides and not be neutral?
Well, for me, I can state again a couple of things that have come to me over this last week or since Saturday. And one is to be somewhat introspective and understand my place in all this, and try to figure out a way to speak out against the words that harm, and speak more of the words that bind and bring together. So that's an important thing that I'll move forward with. And secondly, again, I remember, and I go back to my faith in the scriptures, and I remember that the God who breathed life and called the world into being out of darkness and chaos is the same God that's doing that today. And, that we have to have faith and trust in that there's light shining in this darkness. And it's up to us, certainly as people of faith, to point to that when we see it and hold that up.
Producer Ian has been very silent. I wonder if you got a thought on this. That's how I feel too.
That's kind of what's been going on. I'm taking a politics class.
Yeah.
It's kind of a drastic change, but let me sew it back into what we're talking about. One of the things that we discussed was the political spectrum being left and right and center. This quote talks about how when it's divided, the center becomes unhelpful. And I think one way that politicians should be is directing their attention towards that center, because those people are the most important in making decisions. If you lean too far towards the right, we get issues. And if you lean too far towards the left, you can also get issues. So understanding the middle section and why people are not necessarily leaning left or right or have chosen to be in the center, but understanding that section is key to creating balance in life. And that's sort of what's important about everything.
Good.
Yeah, I like that.
That's very good,
Do you
man.
find, like, at school, is there an awareness of, people are Jewish or Buddhist or Christian or Muslim or whatever else? Like, do people get wound up about this?
Not as you would think.
No.
We are all human, full stop. I guess we are all human should be what should be running through this podcast. But I think as a student, the fact that you may be Jewish or Christian or Muslim or anything else doesn't really matter when what you're focusing on is your calculus test on Friday.
That's right.
So I think,
You nailed it.
so the thing that sort of puts students together and is a collective is wonderful. It binds us together, even though we're all stressing out over calculus or English or whatever. But it's also very negative, I would say. Part of what I see happening is the unawareness of what's going on in the real world. I didn't find out about the shooting until 2 or 3 days later, which is very unfortunate for me, who likes to be caught up in what's going on in the world and what could affect me in the future. But I think as a student, that's what has to happen, because your life isn't in the real world quite yet. You still have other things you need to get through first. Yeah.
Well said, Ian.
It is. And for me, I guess what I would say is I hear those words of Wiesel, and I find that I have to at times repent for being neutral. I think to go back to something you said earlier, Rob, I think sometimes we unwillingly or unwittingly we play along, or we end up being a part of something even when we don't realize we're being sucked into something. And we've all sort of turned our head the other way, or preferred not to get in that argument, or to say the uncomfortable thing, or whatever else. But I think we're being called in the West now, and certainly around the world. Like I said, I think this populism is rising up all over. But I think more and more of all those people that Ian talked about who are in the center, the ones who generally don't vote, there needs to be a real awakening, that we wake up to what's going on around us and actually be aware that our neutrality doesn't help the situation. We have to be participants in it. Your thoughts?
Well, I think I too look at the world. What was something that local politics, whether it's the United States or North America, is being replicated throughout the world. So that's a real shock to the system to realize how much there is to be done, and how attractive some of these more hateful ideas have become to certain parts of society that are showing up to the polls. As we were talking, I was reminded of this one text from our rabbis, and it goes, when you find a place where there is no humanity, strive to be human.
Right.
And I think that really is what we have to do, is we need to recognize where the absence of humanity is, and then we need to fill that space with what's good about humankind and what power we do have for good, and to treat each other as people.
Right.
Can I pop in here real quick?
You can. You're the producer, buddy. You're in charge.
Well, I completely agree with you. When you talk about like popping in to help out in where humankind is not kind, but I think it also has to start with yourself. I know as a student, a lot of the jokes surrounding me is that of like self-deprecation, which is funny once or twice. Sure, everything could be, but if that's where everything starts in you, if that's where you go to help yourself, it doesn't correlate well to trying to help others. If you're joking and you start to genuinely think that you are not how great you could be, then that could correlate to not helping other people, which is not great. obviously.
Yeah, I think you raise a very good point, Ian, because I think that one of the things we all need to be reminded of is that we are beloved. We're all incredibly flawed human beings.
But we're all human.
And we're all human. And we all want to be loved. And if we start from that place, as you say, of that via negativa, that negative way, it's hard to approach anybody else with any positive light if we can't have some positivity about ourselves.
I think you'll appreciate one of the more famous lines from our rabbis, and it goes, "If I'm not for myself, who will be for me? If I'm only for myself, what am I? If not now, when?"
Yeah,
good.
that about sums it up.
That's it.
So, yeah.
It's a good oldie but a goodie.
Yeah.
No, that speaks very much to what we've been talking about here.
And I think that's what Ewan was really saying is, we have to balance, we have to do our own part, we have to do the part in the world, and we need to choose to act.
Right. Finally, then, the Tree of Life Synagogue. Perhaps people have heard this over the last little while with all the media and press going on down there, but the synagogue itself takes its name from Proverbs, a section of Proverbs. So I'd like to read that, and that will bring us a little bit to the end of our podcast today in this important topic that we've been talking about. So from Proverbs we read, "Happy are those who find wisdom and those who get understanding. For her income is better than silver, and her revenue better than gold. She is more precious than jewels, and nothing you desire can compare with her. Long life is in her right hand. In her left hand are riches and honor. Her ways are ways of plenteousness, and her paths are peace. She is a tree of life to those who lay hold of her. Those who hold her fast are called happy." We're all searching for wisdom. We long for her way to lay hold in this world. And so we can ask ourselves, what expressions of this tree of life have you seen in the wake of this tragedy? And how does that speak to you?
Well, in Jewish tradition, the idea of tree of life is also how we describe our Torah, our sacred text. And that's a living thing. We have an ongoing relationship with this text. So it takes us back to the words. We have answers and questions that all come from our text traditions, and our Torah is a tree of life, and that is an evergreen source of challenge and inspiration. But it's by engaging in it that we really do the work that we're intended to do. There's a famous saying that when words of Torah, or sacred text or Bible, are exchanged between two people, the Shekhinah, the indwelling presence of God, comes to earth. So it is through relationship and by sharing words of Torah, that tree of life, that we bring the sacred into our world. And that's something each of us can do.
Very much so. Good.
Well, I think that leaves us in a good place, and I want to extend our gratitude and thanks to you, Rabbi Debra Dressler, for coming and being with us today, and a word of thanks to those who are listening. Just a reminder that if you're looking for us, you can search us out on YouTube, SoundCloud, iTunes, the Vicars Crossing. Obviously, you know that if you're listening to this, because it means you've looked us up somewhere and found us. Share us with your friends. You can tweet us at Vicars Crossing. You can email us at vicarscrossing@gmail.com if you have any feedback or comments on this program. You can also leave comments on our Facebook page at the Vicars Crossing.
Very good. And thank you for being here. On behalf of all of us around the table today at Crossings, we look forward to joining together when we gather again. And so until that time, remember to look both ways
before you cross the street.
Thank you for listening. Our hosts are Kevin George and Rob Henderson. Our producer and composer is myself, Ian, with original artwork done by Catherine Olenek. If you have any questions or want to know how to find us, tweet us at Vicars Crossing or find us on Facebook at The Vicars Crossing. If you have any other questions about anything heard on this podcast, please look in the description to find out more. Thanks.